I'm going to share a story of unprofessionalism in a gaming company, sprinkled in with some child labor that came together to create one of gaming's stupidest scams to date. A game that practically takes home the title of worst video game in history, known as Squidge. Our story takes place in the late 1980s in the mystical land of the United Kingdom. The microcomputer has started creeping its way into the homes of everyday consumers, granted they had money, and with that, many people began entering the coding scene. And a large portion of these new coders were anywhere from as young as little toddlers to full-grown teenagers. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, toddlers can't use their little brains like that yet. But among these new coders was a 13-year-old boy named Jason Kendall, a student who had been learning code through his school's Commodore PET. And after convincing his parents to buy him a VIC-20, he created his first ever game mainly meant for the Commodore 64, the infamous Squidge. Here's a little bit of gameplay. I can't believe anyone is excited for GTA 6 when this is already available. I'm making fun of a child here, what has my life become? Anyways, although he had dreams of letting Squidge loose in the market, he quickly realized that he was just a kid. He didn't have the money nor connections to mass produce his game and have them on retail shelves. However, his luck would soon change. A British game publishing company, CRL Group, had just opened up a little subdivision known as the Powerhouse, which would focus on publishing CRL's back catalog and budget games or whatever the hell they could find underneath the school desks. But at some point, that well was running dry and they were running out of games. And so, they decided to put out an open call for any and all developers to send in their game ideas for a chance at some real publishing. It doesn't matter the age, doesn't matter the experience, just send it in and they'll have a look-see. And of course, the requests were flooded by many youth, most not necessarily meeting the house's already low standards. Not the age standards, no, they don't give a shit about age, I'm talking about their games. And among these youth was obviously Jason Kendall, but there was also another notable Jason Creighton. Creighton was a 15-year-old programmer whose games didn't necessarily meet the house's criteria, but at the very least they thought he could be of use in case they ever needed a helping hand. Anyways, back to Kendall. The Powerhouse were surprisingly interested in publishing Squidge. They saw potential, and so they offered him a nice flat sum of 300 euros and would later release it for the Commodore 64 at a measly price of just around 2 euros. Now, similar to modern times, the basic rule of thumb was to publish your games for multiple platforms, making sure you squeeze the shit out of that cow until it runs dry. And one of the more popular platforms at the time was known as the ZX Spectrum. The Powerhouse hit up Kendall's line and asked if he would be down to code the port over to the Spectrum. Unfortunately for them, however, Kendall stated that he just didn't know Z80, the microprocessing unit within the Spectrum, and wasn't really interested in learning it at the time. And so, the Powerhouse found themselves in a bit of a conundrum. Or so they would have if they cared about ethical business practices in the first place. When one child won't do the job, you move on to the next. That sounds terrible, but my point is, they decided to hit up Jason number 2's line and asked if he would port the game instead. To which he obviously accepted. I mean, getting an opportunity to develop and work for a sizable company at that age? Who wouldn't agree? Now, the Powerhouse obviously had him sign a contract, and in this contract were 2 lines that are going to be important in a little bit. The first was that though he would only be given a flat fee for his work, he would also be entitled to 5% of all sales his version generated. And the second stated that the Powerhouse reserved the right to reject the game and ultimately end the partnership if they deemed the game to be extremely shitty, as I like to put it. After signing the contract, Creighton was invited into the house's office to take a peek and familiarize himself with the game that he was porting. Unbeknownst to him, however, this would be the only look he'd ever get to see of the game. The company quite literally refused to supply him with a copy of it, only giving him a map of the game, which, I mean, to some degree was useful, but not really as much as the game itself would be. So of course he went to the offices to ask for the game himself, only to be told to either screw off or that it was his fault for not having what he needed, which obviously pissed him off as it would anyone. And so he gave the finger to them and just decided that he wouldn't do his job out of spite, despite being contractually obligated. I mean, even if he wanted to do the work, he really couldn't. He couldn't even reference the game he was supposed to be basically recreating. Why didn't he just buy a copy himself, you may ask? Well, though there's no clear answer from him, I can safely assume that it was due to the bad blood. If the company you're working for doesn't provide what you need for your job and instead blames you for not having it, why go any distance at all for their sake? Anyways, the original release date of December 1985 came and went with nothing, obviously. And after delaying the game to February of 1986, the Clown House finally saw it fit to send Creighton a copy around the end of January. With the game's release right around the corner, they finally decided to send him the game. But that's not even the worst part. The Commodore 64 had 2 different drives that would read and run games. One was a floppy diskette drive and the other was a cassette drive. Creighton had a cassette, but the powerhouse sent him a floppy disk. To those of you that are too young to understand what the hell I'm even saying, just imagine trying to slide in a vinyl disc into a PS5. It won't work. Creighton took 1 second to consider asking them for either the drive to run the game or another version, but in the next second realized just how much of a hassle it was to even get a copy of the game in general, and it really just wasn't worth the trouble anymore. He slid the disc next to the game's map and went back to ignoring it, focusing on his schoolwork, other projects, or literally anything that just didn't have to do with Squidge. Unfortunately for him, however, it wasn't that easy to get out of a contract, and the house was literally breathing down his neck, pestering him to finish the game. At some point, the pestering became too much for Creighton to handle, and he just wanted to be free from these clowns and go back to his normal quiet life. But the only way to do that was to muster all his strength and create the damn game he agreed to almost a year ago by this point. He sat down on his computer and literally worked away at the game for the next 40 hours, at 16 by now mind you. And those 40 hours were spent not to create a good game or anything, but instead to hit a new world record for the game development speedrun any percent category. He still didn't have a copy of Squidge he could reference, and so he opted into the memory route to avoid losing time. By that I mean the only reference he used was any recollection he had from the bits and pieces he saw at the offices. At least the map came in somewhat handy, though not by that much. He also found a nice little time save by using a software known as Laser Basics, created by a behemoth company known as Ocean Software, which he bought for around 15 euros. This will come back later, so keep it in mind. As he whisked away at the computer, coding as fast as his arms could go, he silently hoped that the finished product was so shitty that the house had no choice but to reject it outright and he would finally be free. And once everything was said and done, he created a game that was theoretically playable. Not technically playable, theoretically. Once you load up the game, you were prompted to press 1 to start, which you'll quickly come to realize is the only time the game is functional, because you literally could not move your character whatsoever. It turns out that one line of code in the game basically made it so that no matter what, every single key was set to its uppercase values, as if caps lock was enabled. And since this was the 80s, uppercase and lowercase letters were treated as different values. So lowercase Z, X, K, and M, which were the movement keys, were different than their uppercase counterparts. The only way to fix this was by going into the game's code and changing a specific value that would remove the caps lock toggle. But even if you did successfully get your bird to move, you'll see just how much of a buggy mess this game truly was. I mean hell, bits of your body are literally just left laying around. Let's talk more about that code actually. So the game's main quest was to find and bring items back to the center of the map. However, it seems that the code for picking up was so bugged that it just didn't work at all. And even if you were to go in and change it so that it did work, if you picked up more than one item at a time, your value was set to 0, as if you hadn't picked up anything in the first place. Another thing that was more of a problem for the powerhouse as opposed to Creighton was that he didn't bother compiling the code whatsoever. He was shooting for the world record after all. In normal people terms, compiling code basically means making it smaller, I think. I don't know, I'm a normal person too. And since the code was practically still in its original state, the Laser Basics software was littered around and could be found everywhere. If the game were to be released in this state, anybody that gets a hold of it would essentially be able to recreate a 1-to-1 copy of that software, which wouldn't fare well for the powerhouse. Copyright infringement is nothing to scoff at. What's funny is that Creighton apparently called the company to let them know he was going to be using this software in his game, which was already not even allowed to be used for commercial projects in the first place, and they basically just told him, cool, get back to work. With all this in mind, you'd think the moment the house received the game, they would have almost immediately tossed it into the dumpster and sent Creighton into the Shadow Realm. After all, it would have taken only 5 seconds to see that the game was not only not playable, but also unreleasable due to copyright concerns. But whether it was due to a lack of care or the fact that the game had been delayed for so long, they just slapped it in a little box and sold that baby for a whopping 2 euros, about $5 in today's money. And now, Creighton's plan of getting outright rejected had failed, and he had accidentally just scammed any unsuspecting gamer out of their little pockets. And also the already shallow pockets of the clown house, I mean. Of course $5 isn't that much, but that's still money you were spending on something that quite literally didn't work. It's like buying a Steam game and finding out the executable file wasn't even inside. It's a scam. But funnily enough, there's a little more to the story. A little while later, the clown house decided to release a bundle of 8 of their most notable games to bring in some nice extra profits. And can you guess what game was included? Yeah, I know you already guessed. It was Squidge. Not even a fixed version or anything. The exact same unplayable version was just tossed in there like it was nothing. Also, not too long ago, Creighton was looking to cash in on his 5% of royalties, and so he called up the CRL offices and asked them for his money. This is where we learned that apparently his version of Squidge had sold a massive 250 copies. And his compensation was a nice little 25 euros. Of course, it's not the biggest scam in the world, but it is still worth talking about so we can see just how crazy the video game market was back in the day. That shit like this could just be sold like it was nothing. If you're anything like me who doesn't even like spending that much money on food to, you know, keep me alive, $5 is a hell of a lot of money to lose. I could have thrown that into the claw machine for God's sake. Little side note on that Laser Basics copyright infringement, it doesn't seem that Ocean ever decided to sue the powerhouse, or at least I couldn't find any proof of it. Whether they just didn't really care as nobody liked Basics anyway, or because the house went bust too quickly to file a suit against, we'll never know. Anyways, that's all. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe, comment how much you love Squidge or something. I've been a Squidge, you've been watching a ZX Spectrum, and ciao ciao.